I'm super excited about the opportunity to collaborate with startups. I think that because we need tools and they need market proof, that we could really be of great service to each other. And I also think that as the world's biggest design firm, we have a real opportunity to help develop the tools of the future, even a responsibility to help scale some of these companies.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate technologies. I'm your host, Samia, and today I'm speaking with Naomi Sakamoto, a principal and studio lead at Gensler. Gensler is the largest architecture firm in the world, both by revenues and by number of architects. In 2022, the company generated $1.7 billion in revenue and currently has clients in over 100 countries. The company is responsible for some of the most iconic projects in the world, including the Shanghai Tower, the city center in Las Vegas, and the San Francisco Airport, which is a project that Naomi worked on herself. Naomi studied civil engineering and urban studies at Stanford and completed a Master of Architecture at Harvard. In the early part of her career, she worked as an architect in Beijing and Paris before joining Gensler in San Francisco, where she's from, nearly a decade ago. She joined the London office in 2019 and leads their technology practice for the European region. Gensler has a goal of a zero carbon impact portfolio by 2030. This is important. The built environment, or the physical parts of where we live and work, is responsible for about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So Gensler's commitment to a zero carbon impact for itself and the projects it works on for its clients will be hugely impactful. I met Naomi in the early part of last year, and her genuine passion for climate tech is immediately apparent when you speak with her. And I really wanted to be able to share how and where Gensler is looking to use technology to reach their net zero goals. And this is exactly what we discussed today. We also cover how they keep up with the regulatory landscape in the countries in which they operate, how startups can break into deeply embedded industries like construction and real estate, and how Gensler has already started to partner with climate tech startups. Just one more thing before we move on to the episode. Corporates play an outsized role in the net zero transition. More than 9,000 companies have pledged to halve global emissions by 2030. And if you look at the data tracked by Climate Policy Initiative on private climate finance, corporations have accounted for the largest share of the total private capital flowing into climate in the 2019-2020 timeframe, which is the most recent data they have. I am a big believer that climate tech startups that partner with and engage with corporates early on, either as customers, off-takers, or operational partners, these companies will have a huge advantage in the market and the opportunity to massively scale and outperform their competitors. And so one of my objectives with this podcast is to speak with people that are leading their net zero transitions within corporates and better understand which technologies they're actively looking for to accelerate this transition. Many of these companies that have net zero pledges are private, and even if they're public, they're not out there publicizing exactly what they're doing or looking for. So I think these conversations are extremely important. Okay, now on to the episode. So I remember when you and I met and you told me about Gensler's net zero goal. And I remember thinking, how is that achievable? Because your goal is to have a zero carbon impact portfolio by 2030, which is in 6 years. And it's not just for you, it's for all the projects that you work on. That's for your clients too. And on top of that, you operate in an industry where you're heavily reliant on things like just things that are incredibly hard to decarbonize, like cement, concrete, transportation. How is Gensler thinking about that?
It's a great question. And I think, as you said, we started out, first of all, realizing what a big potential for impact we have as the world's largest design company. So we're like, oh gosh, we're within an industry where we're responsible for 40% of global emissions. We are the biggest player within that industry, so we can really make a lot of change. How we do that, exactly as you pointed out, is something we're continuing to work on. And I think we're working on it at a lot of different scales. One of those scales is thinking about what should be built. I think there's a lot of conversation right now about, particularly in London and in the UK, about retrofit first. Can we take building stock as a bank of materials and use the embodied carbon that's already in the building industry for better? as opposed to continuously introducing new buildings, more concrete, more steel, more raw materials. So one of the first questions we ask nowadays is, do you need a new building at all? And if you do need a new building, how big should it be? Do you really need 1 million square feet? Or is there a way we can think about the way you work and the way you operate within space so that we can be more efficient and really use less space, less volume, and less materials? On the other side of the spectrum, we're also looking within our commercial interiors practice at materials themselves. So if you think about the 1 billion square feet of interiors projects that we do every year, you can imagine 1 billion square feet of carpet, 1 billion square feet of ceiling tile, 1 billion square feet times 2 to 4 walls of acoustic wall material. And all of a sudden you can see there's a huge opportunity to use better materials, make better choices about what we're putting into buildings to impact the overall embodied carbon of our projects. And as part of that, we've developed a series of specifications that we call GPS, the Gensler product specifications, and it sets both minimum targets for embodied carbon, global warming potential, recyclability, major KPIs like that for all the key materials we use, and also a set of aspirational targets where we really need to be going in the next 2 to 3 years in order to hit those net zero goals.
So how do you think about materials? I was telling you that I come across a lot of new materials. Like recently I was looking at a company that's building buildings entirely out of hemp.
Yeah.
We get things like this all the time, low carbon materials. What do you think about in terms of like insurability? And when some of these technologies haven't been proven, can you use those new low carbon materials?
There is definitely a challenge to using these materials. And so what we try to do is use our projects as a testing ground or a piloting opportunity for some of these materials, where we can use them in a space that is safe, that's observable, that's reversible. So if it doesn't hold up to durability expectations, for example, you can just take it out and replace it. We do think that biomaterials and new materials are going to be a big part of what we design with in the future. And so I think it's really important that companies like us find the right opportunities and the right clients who have the appetite to be a little bit experimental to try them. That said, I think we're also doing a huge amount of work with commercial suppliers of materials to figure out not just how to make their materials better, but also how we can start to infiltrate the entire supply chain all the way down. They also have their suppliers, their various logistics routes, and there's opportunity all the way up and down the supply chain for us to make better decisions, source from closer places, use better adhesives, make a lot of decisions beyond that first choice of what the material is, all the way down to an assembly that in the aggregate has a better footprint.
Some of these materials can't be insured. And in fact, in your building, you've used some low carbon materials that haven't been insured. Is that realistic? Would most of your clients be willing to do something like that?
Yeah, well, it was a fight to get them insured. Definitely took a certain amount of will and effort and time, and we knew that we were going to have to invest that in order to get the materials that we wanted. But it was really important to us because we're a design firm and we wanted to tell those stories and show what's possible. I think that's not the right answer for everybody, but there are enough clients out there who are really ambitious and they want to do something different. And they're also just interested in the stories that materials tell. It's the first thing that you interact with in a space. You actually touch it and you sit on it and you lean against it. And so people want to know where they come from. A few examples that have come up recently are we have consumer goods companies that make things that come in plastic bottles. And they love the story of countertop solid surfaces that are made with their plastic bottles recycled within them. And so they can actually see their product and how it continues to have a life beyond just what goes out the door of their company. So I think if we can tie them into stories a little bit and tie them into the ambitions and the values of the company, we can often find an appetite within some of the big clients to do something a little bit different and a little bit experimental. And just to your point as well, I think we are seeing a lot of pilots and experimental spaces themselves, which means that clients may not have the appetite to take a 15-year lease the way they did before because they're just not sure what their office space needs to be, what it wants to do. But that's also an opportunity for us to say, you know, you're only going to be here for 2 years. You've taken a temporary space. Let's try something and see how long it lasts and see what works. And if it works, great. We'll put it into your next space. If it doesn't work, now we know, and we'll get that information back to the supplier and we'll see if collectively we can build some intelligence into the system to make these products better and better.
There's so many given that you're such a global firm, you have to think about the regulations, not just in the EU, which is complex in itself because there's so many countries, but also in the UK and America and India. How do you guys keep up to date with regulations and what's coming on? And how do you incorporate that into the projects that you do for your clients?
It's really hard. And I'm not the expert on regulations. I think what we're seeing, particularly with things like biomaterials and really a lot of the more complex aspects of what we're trying to accomplish with our climate goals, is that it relies on a community of experts and elders who can help us get there. So if we're seeing new laws come online in California, for example, there are new embodied carbon regulations. We really need to consult with some of the people who know those laws the best and figure out what that means. Sometimes when we're lucky, we can get to the table and be part of making those regulations happen, particularly in places like California, where we have a big footprint and we might be involved with those organizations anyway. Where we're on the receiving end, I think we need to understand what they are by engaging with the people who made them and know them best. But I also think we have a responsibility to push them a little bit. Everyone's experimenting, and if we go to some of these organizations, it doesn't work in every municipality. If we can go and say, hey, I want to do this thing. It's aligned with the vision that you've enacted. It's aligned with what you want to do, but it's not really aligned with the nuts and bolts. Is there something we can do here? How should we respond? And a lot of times we will see a willingness to engage, if not immediately accept. I think one example we might give is the London plan has really specific requirements around bicycle parking, for example. And that's coming from the best possible place of wanting to create positive incentives around cycling and meet LEED requirements and LEED certifications and to give alternatives to driving and public transportation even.
Is that for electric bikes as well?
It's for both. Yeah. So I think we've seen electric bikes, the fold-up bikes, and kind of traditional cycles all accommodated.
I'm so glad. I see people they just drop them off on the sidewalk. It's
the electric. Oh, I know. It's terrible. It's terrible. It's a really good thing, right? And it's good that we have not just cycle parking, but also end-of-trip facilities, so showers and changing rooms. But I think a knock-on effect that maybe couldn't have been predicted is that because buildings are required to put in so much cycle parking, they put it in basements, obviously. You're not going to use prime real estate for cycle parking. And so then all of a sudden, you see buildings that would otherwise have pretty decent carbon footprints, increasing that number due to the concrete and the foundation structure required to build a basement. So we have had conversations with various boroughs saying, look, we embrace the intention and the ambition of your cycle parking scheme. Is there a smarter way to accomplish what you want to accomplish that won't require certain developers, certain building owners to invest in high carbon construction in order to meet these requirements?
I was watching the webinar you were doing for Space Store, and you said something along the lines of the fact that designers don't necessarily have the right tools to make the smartest decisions, and that you love, especially in your role involved with the technology studio, that you really look to the startup community. You said you're really interested in which solutions are out there looking for a problem. And I'd love to flip that question on you and ask you, what problems do you experience that tech can solve? Not necessarily that there are technologies that exist out there right now, but what I would love is for founders to listen to this podcast and listen to how you're thinking about technology, but your role as the largest design and architecture firm in the world. You are the customer for a lot of these companies that are building technology, software and hardware solutions in the built environment. So I would love for people to be able to listen to this and think, oh, I have a startup that Gensler would be the perfect customer for this, whether you know it or not.
First of all, I'm slightly mortified that you went back and listened to my podcast. I always assume they just go into the ether and nobody ever listens to them.
No, it wasn't that.
Except I forgot the word biophilia. I was completely blanked on it. Anyway.
But it's not an easy word to remember. But it was recent, wasn't it?
It was in summer, I think. August, maybe.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I actually listened to the entire thing. I never ever watch entire webinars, but yeah, I thought it was really engaging. Yeah, so I would love to hear about that because it's not a easy thing for startups to have access to their customers, or especially if they're large corporates. And when you look at investment going into climate and climate infrastructure, corporates play such a massive role. I mean, a huge outsized role, much more so than early stage investors or venture funding. It's sort of governments and then banks and then corporates. And so, yeah, I would like for people to really be thinking about how their product or service could help you guys.
Yeah. When I've thought about this in the past, in my mind, there's a couple different categories in which I would absolutely love to find the right solution. One of them is really coming from our clients, and that's about how buildings are used and how they could be used. So really looking at behavior of people and behavior of buildings, not as two separate systems, but as a single thing. We have some tools that do one thing or another, right? We have ways that we can track occupancy using badge data, using CO2 monitors. We have some tools that are starting to emerge about optimizing building systems. So making sure you've got the right amount of air based on who's actually using the space. I think we're still looking for that one tool to rule them all that will help us figure out if we can start to see how buildings are actually being used, find some patterns over time, have the building itself and the systems within it respond to how it's likely to be used on a given day, then I think that would help us and really help our clients make some better decisions about where users are finding value in their buildings. For example, are they using all the meeting rooms in the middle of a Wednesday, all the focus booths on a Tuesday? How do we know what spaces are valuable when, so that we can provide more of them, heat and cool them appropriately, and really in the end sort of optimize the in-use energy and the heating and cooling footprint of the buildings based on what we're pretty sure is going to happen over time. So that's one. We've talked to a couple companies that are doing similar things. So I think there's probably cool solutions out there that I would love to hear about, but it's all about that integration with sensors in the building, IoT, and the BMS systems of a building so that they're all talking to each other as a system. And we're starting to build digital twins of all of our buildings as well, so that you have sort of a live simulation and tracking over time of how the building's behaving and how people are operating within it. So if we could tie all of that together, that would be amazing.
A complete end-to-end solution.
Yeah, that would be so cool, right? And just understanding people within buildings. I think we're really good at seeing one or the other, and we're not very good at understanding how they work together. So I think that would be of a lot of interest to our clients. Because like I said at the beginning, they're all asking themselves, what are our buildings for? Where should I invest? What sorts of spaces should I invest in? And what's the right size of investment? How many square feet should I be taking of what kind of space? And so if we could have better data around all of that, even dynamic data, I think that would be really cool.
And is that more of a question now with people after the pandemic, with people working from home a lot and not going into offices as much? Is that more of a concern for employers?
Yeah, it's absolutely right, because lots of employers have, if not a completely digital first or remote first policy, a lot of employers are giving autonomy back to employees and team members to make decisions about when and where they work. And so you often see even steeper peaks and troughs than we would have seen pre-pandemic. So some places that are really crowded on a Wednesday, but total wasteland Monday and Friday, for example. This obviously makes it really hard to heat and cool buildings, and it makes it really hard to know, should you plan for the Wednesday? Should you plan for the Friday? And part of that, I think, is about understanding the overall footprint, the overall economic and environmental impact of those choices that you're making. Are you choosing for a Monday to Friday office? And then what does that cost you? And what is the environmental footprint of that choice? Or are you planning for a Tuesday to Thursday office? In which case, what does that cost you? And what's the environmental footprint of that choice?
So going back to that question around technology, so that kind of covers a lot of what you guys are focused on around repurposing existing buildings and not necessarily creating new buildings. Is there anything else on the other side of that that you sort of constantly encountering over and over again where you feel like technology could really be helpful in solving this problem and making things easier for us?
Yeah, I think the other side of that, in the broadest possible sense, is just about helping us make better decisions, both in the design phase and in the implementation phase, and even in the pre-design phase, even when you're just trying to decide, do I use an existing building or do we build a new one? I think as designers and as advisors to our clients, we often feel like there are trade-offs. We know there are trade-offs, in fact. So is it better to choose a material that is low global warming potential? Is it better to choose a material that's locally sourced? Is it better to choose a material with an end-of-life plan? How do we know which of these things is objectively better? Is one of these things objectively better? Which of those decisions is the right one? And we're starting to have some tools that help us look at that at a material level. so we can start to make apples to apples comparisons. But once all of that gets aggregated up into building scale decisions, like, do I have an atrium or not? Do I introduce cellular offices or is it open plan? What does that really mean in terms of the overall footprint? And so I think being able to tie design decisions to really clear projections and models of carbon footprint and other kinds of environmental impact of our choices would be incredibly helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the space right now. I think climate, it's always really challenging, especially with sectors like this, because when you look at construction tech, it's an old, archaic sector. And there are a lot of things that have been done in a very specific analog way because that's the way people like to do it. And so it's not always easy to break into those sectors with technology or even things like agriculture, right? Like you can go in and say, hey, this piece of technology could really improve efficiency for your employees and it could make the design process a lot easier. But people still don't want to use it because they have their own ways of doing things. What do you think are some of the barriers that you're going to come across when trying to incorporate technology into some of these industries?
I do think you're right that construction and real estate are deeply embedded industries. They've been around for a long time, and there is very much a sense that people know how to do things. So change is slow, and I think that can be frustrating. That said, I think we're seeing more and more of the big developers, for example, and the big construction companies who are starting to embrace technology as the future of their companies. So you'll see big developers around the UK who are investing in technology almost on a venture basis. And they understand that in order for them to manage their portfolio and make smart decisions about really large portfolios, they're going to need better tools. Same with construction. I think in order to manage things like material flows, they're not going to be able to do it with a clipboard and a pen. There's got to be some more intelligent ways to be tagging things in and out and really tracking all of the things that we're required to track. So part of it, as you said, is just about when it becomes harder to maintain the status quo than it is to try something new. A lot of people have that appetite to try something new. That said, I do think there can be a little bit of almost fatigue around lots of different tools, not wanting to make the wrong choice. And especially when people are looking beyond their own industry and their own area of expertise, they might feel like they're not informed enough to know which tool is really worthwhile, to be able to trust the information that's coming out the other side, because we don't necessarily have the information to judge, is this a good data set? Is this not a good data set? Is it a good algorithm? Is it not a good algorithm? So sometimes we will hear from partners and collaborators that like, look, I know there's tools that can do this, but I don't really know if they're any good, or I don't know which one's best. And that makes it difficult for me to go up to my executive board and say, we need to buy this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's one example.
I wonder if there's better ways for early stage companies to partner with you guys to try and come up with the right solution because of that market timing, because it can be tricky, right? What you guys need is a finished product that works with like accurate data sets, and what they need is to iterate with their customers.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm super excited about the opportunity to collaborate with startups. I think that because we need tools and they need market proof, that we could really be of great service to each other. And I also think that as the world's biggest design firm, we have a real opportunity to help develop the tools of the future, even a responsibility to help scale some of these companies. And we have a couple examples that I can speak to of when we've done things like this. Sometimes just being tested or demonstrated in a Gensler project is enough to accelerate the development of some of these. So I'm really excited about that and think that the future of a lot of the tools and products and materials is going to come from the startup community.
I would love to hear about these examples. I know about a couple of them, but yeah, I would love to hear about them.
Well, there's one that I could talk about for ages, so please stop me, Samia, when we start hitting hour 4. I was really inspired by a direct air capture project that most of your listeners would probably be familiar with. It's called Orca, and it's a Climeworks installation in Iceland that pulls CO2 out of ambient air. I was certainly familiar with direct air capture, but had never really seen it in operation until I learned a little bit more about this project. And what I wondered when I looked at it was I looked at the components, which were a fan, lots of fans, actually, electricity, lots of electricity, and realized that every commercial building in the world has a lot of fans and a lot of electricity. Is there an opportunity there for us to piggyback on all these systems that already exist and essentially turn every commercial office building in the world into a carbon absorber? Wouldn't that be cool? Did a little bit of research and found out that, of course, there's some great startups that are already looking at this. We partnered up with one of them, which is a company called Solitaire Power based out of Finland. They had a prototype that was already tested in a couple different places, and they had a few versions that were market ready. And we were really interested in the first instance in just understanding if it works from a carbon footprint perspective. We know that it takes some amount of material to build these machines. We know that it takes some amount of electricity to maintain them and keep them running. The sorbents have a footprint of their own. If you take all those things together, does it actually make sense? So again, we partnered with an engineering firm. Solitaire Power was amazing about really opening their books to us and saying, this is the full materiality, the full operating requirements of all of our machines. Our engineering partners in Troba ran all the numbers, and we were really pleased to see that it could be a really important aspect of our toolkit going into the future. It can actually pull a lot more CO2 out of the air than it consumes. And obviously, like many emergent technologies, it's on track to get more and more efficient, both in terms of size and operating energy over time. So if you look at it as a complement to renewable energies, it's really an exciting option. So then, as a designer and as an architect, what I was interested in is, what does this mean for our buildings? How do we design buildings and spaces differently if you have these direct air capture units on the rooftop? And for me, that was tied to the question of, what do you do with all the CO2 once you've captured it? You've pulled it out of the air, but obviously if you just release it back again, there's no net benefit. So we looked at 3 different work streams that we called solid, liquid, and gas. We looked at mineralizing the CO2 that's pulled out of the atmosphere into the major materials that you use within a building. So you can turn it, can you use it as a replacement for gypsum board? Can you use it as a replacement for acoustic wall panels or ceiling panels or workstations? These are a huge contributor to the embodied carbon of our projects. And if we can replace them with something that's actually carbon negative, we could actually move the needle hugely in a positive direction. So that's one thing that we're looking at on the solid side. On the liquid side, which is actually the state in which the current prototype holds the carbon, we were interested in whether we could replace the CFCs and HCFCs in building heating and cooling systems with liquid CO2. It has some really exciting properties. It works really well. And so that's also another opportunity for us to heat and cool a building based on what you've actually pulled out of the air and replace more noxious chemicals. I'm also interested on the liquid side in things that might be a little more frivolous, but like, can you use it for zip taps and espresso machines? And then when you go in and you use a building... SodaStream, exactly. You go and use a building and you're like, the bubble water I just got has been pulled out of the air. And yes, eventually it's going to make its way back out there again. But what a cool story is that? And it connects me to what it is that we're doing and the decisions we're making. And then the last one I'll mention on the liquid side is a company called Energy Dome that's out of Italy. And they're looking at liquid CO2 as a long-term battery storage, long-term energy storage. So basically like a CO2 battery. And so that means that if we could use the CO2 that we've captured in liquid form as a battery, then all of a sudden it's the buildings themselves that can enable a renewable grid. When the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, the buildings can store that electricity. So I'm really excited about that opportunity as well. So we're exploring all these different things. And I think in the aggregate, what they mean is that we could have ecosystems that think more broadly about the building beyond the boundaries itself and really have positive choices tied to positive experiences for the people who are using the buildings.
Those are amazing examples. How would a company like Energy, did they find you? Did you find them? How did that process start?
I found them, and full disclosure, we haven't talked about this yet. We haven't engaged. I'm just very inspired by what they do. But I do have a tendency to just reach out to companies and say, hey, I love what you're doing. Can we do something together? And I think there's a lot that can come of just starting the conversation and seeing where it goes. I think founders obviously have a lot on their plate, and we're trying to be respectful of that. But at the same time, I think we hope we have something to offer to them as well in terms of opportunity to engage with the industry.
Absolutely. It's like you and I talked about before, but just the ability to work with Gensler could be a game changer for some of these startups as they're working through their pilot phases or even later. And in terms of funding, like for example, for the DAC project, would they get external funding? Would this be funded by grant or the company? How did that work?
Yeah, so in this instance, Gensler does have a research institute, which really pays for Gensler employees' time to devote to projects beyond our client's work. In this instance, we devoted our own time. It was something that a team of us were really excited about, and so we just did in all of our free time. And the same for our engineering partners. It was something they were curious about. They got some funding to conduct their research, and it really covered their time. But we've also been looking at opportunities for grants and opportunities to use R&D funding that could be available through governments, for example, to actually install some prototypes. The one I'm most excited about, though, is actually getting clients on board, because I think if we can have a client who sees a benefit in being the first adopter, the first out of the gate, then it's a huge possible benefit for them. And obviously it mobilizes this whole supply chain of people and thinkers to actually make it happen. So we are working with a couple clients in the US to try a DAC installation and see if we can actually get it off the ground and learn a bit from it.
And that is it for today's episode and my conversation with Naomi. If you would like to connect with Naomi, you can click on her LinkedIn profile in the show notes. And if you found this episode useful, please subscribe. Thank you for listening and hope to catch you at the next one.